Good evening y buenas noches. Welcome to everyone tuning in for tonight's community conversation on student mental health in Chicago schools. I'm Araceli Gomez-Aldana, a reporter and anchor for WBEZ. Tonight's program is about giving you, Chicago parents, Chicago guardians, information and resources to help you keep your kids happy and healthy ahead of the new school year. And we know from talking with parents and community partners and from gathering your questions that child's mental health is a top concern for Chicagoans. And before we get too far into tonight's program, I want to remind you that we have a live Spanish interpretation available, and that's thanks to our interpreter, Catalina Maria Johnson. So if you would like to access the Spanish live interpretation of this discussion, you can head over to Zoom by clicking the link in the comment section of this video on WBEZ's YouTube page. And if you have any issues or need any help, just leave us a comment and someone will be able to help you. Si desea escuchar esta conversación en español, puede dirigirse en Zoom haciendo el clic en el enlace que está en la sección de los comentarios de este video y en la página de YouTube de WBEZ. So, si tiene problemas o necesita ayuda, nomás déjenos un comentario y alguien se puede comunicar con usted. All right, so it's no surprise that so many of you are worried about childhood mental health. Last year, the federal government surveyed high schoolers and found that 37% of them had poor mental health during the COVID-19 pandemic. And last fall, the American Academy of Pediatrics declared the youth mental health crisis a national emergency. Also, mental health care is inaccessible to many families in Chicago, and barriers can be financial, cultural, informational, or just personal. And navigating the care and support structures for children in schools can be challenging all on its own. That's why WBEZ, Illinois Latino News, and the Chicago Reporter worked with our many community partners to survey parents and hear what questions and concerns you have about child's mental health. And you told us about bullying, trauma, social isolation, school safety, grief, and of course, stress. So tonight's panel of mental health and education experts was chosen with your concerns in mind. So our goal is to answer as many questions as we can and to talk about what's available, especially resources for you. So we'll be able to find those resources, where to discuss online. So you can find all of that at wbez.org/mental health. And that page will also be translated into Spanish in a couple of weeks. So we'll follow up with Spanish speaking those that registered, and that'll be ready for you. Un poco de español, la página de recursos que vamos a producir sobre esta conversación va a ser traducida en español y en un par de semanas va a poder encontrar ese enlace en su correo electrónico. So if you have any questions for the panelists at any time tonight, do us a favor and please leave a comment on YouTube or wherever you're watching this conversation, and you may hear it answered later in the show. Si tiene una pregunta para los expertos durante esta conversación, por favor deje un comentario en YouTube o donde esté viendo esta conversación y vamos a ver si escuchamos la respuesta más adelante en el programa. All right, finally, we'll be giving away some back-to-school gift cards from Joel Osco at the end of our program for those of you who registered for the event today. Thanks to Joel Osco for sharing these prizes just in time for school shopping. I know a lot of people waited till the last minute to do that. So we also want to say thanks to all of our community partners for supporting this event, especially Association House. And we want to thank the organizers and members of the Chicagoland Mom Squad Facebook group who helped inspire the conversation that we're having tonight. All right, first off tonight, we're going to discuss the mental health issues of children and teens, what they're experiencing right now, and how to manage them, and where to turn for professional support. After that, we're going to look inside Chicago schools and learn what supports are available there, and see what kids are learning about emotional and mental health in the classroom. And during our last 25 minutes, we're going to talk about how to help children and teens grapple with the trauma and stressful world events. So we'll start off. I'm happy to welcome our first round of panelists to the screen tonight. Joining us, we have Dr. Tara Gill, psychologist and mental health consultant for the Center for Childhood Resilience at Lurie Children's Hospital. Dr. Gill collaborates with school and youth organizations to build culturally attuned and trauma-informed support systems, helping connect kids to services. Welcome, Dr. Gill.
Thank you so much.
Also in the section, we have Myra Rodriguez, the Community Health Supervisor for Association House, a Humboldt Park nonprofit that advocates for multicultural, economic, and educational advancement for Chicagoans. Myra provides mental health, first aid clinics across the city and focuses on serving communities with health disparities. Welcome, Myra. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
All right, let's start with maybe some of the basics. So let's see. We got several questions about parents like Chevron from South Shore who wonders, when is a child's behavior seen as mental health issues? And when is it just a child being a child, right? So Maida, let's start with you. How can parents tell the difference between what's normal and what could be mental health issues that need some attention?
I think when we talk about mental health disorders and children, it can be difficult to differentiate between what is typical adolescent development or typical behavior in children and what is something more. So often I think that because teenagers and their developing bodies, developing brains, we can sometimes make assumptions that, well, kids are kids, they're teenagers. But when we start to see maybe patterns or we start to see differences in behaviors that are not typical to that child, perhaps they're sleeping all the time now, which is maybe something they weren't doing before. Maybe there's changes in eating more or eating less, isolating themselves, and maybe that wasn't typical for them. Then we need to start asking questions. Because those are differences. This is something that would be a change that we see in a child, and how consistent is that change, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think a lot of parents, and we got a lot of survey responses that they're worried about their kids' stress and anxiety levels. So we'll talk a little bit about how to get professional help. But first, I'm thinking about what can parents do to help their kids navigate all of this. Lots of parents are worried about school stresses, too much homework, the pressure of after-school activities. We had one parent, Michelle from the Southwest side, that says, my child is going into second grade and already we feel pressure to get her settled for high school. Dr. Gill, what advice can you give to parents and how to help kids when something like from school is stressing them out? And I feel like both parents and kids are stressed in that situation.
Absolutely. I think it's really important for parents to recognize that they can set the tone in their household based on their family values. While we all want our kids to be successful, what's needed at second grade is very different than what you need to be successful in high school. So really trying to stay in the moment and thinking about, what does a second grader need? They may need a routine structure as they transition back to school that might look and feel different than their summer activities. Then they also may need some modeling from parents that it's okay. If the parents are high anxiety and they are modeling that they're worried and anxious, their children will pick up on that. So establishing a routine and creating a sense of emotional and physical safety is really going to help and take them a long way, and really getting parent engagement with the school to make sure that school is an extension of home and home is an extension of the school environment.
Dr. Gill, do you recommend talking about that stress? I feel like sometimes there isn't a conversation. Everybody just feels it, but nobody really knows how to talk about it.
It's really so important. And I think it's important to recognize that in the city of Chicago, where there are many cultures, culturally, for some communities, talking about stress or mental health or illness may not be something that's socially acceptable. So making sure that parents start the dialogue and not waiting for kids to bring their worries and concerns to them, but making it be a part of your regular routine, asking about your day, establishing communication that you care about what's happening to them, not just to their bodies, but what's happening to the inside of their bodies, and giving them the language to be able to talk about that. You mentioned like a younger kid. So across the developmental spectrum, you can have those conversations with youth across different ages.
All right. So be proactive, right?
Being very proactive. Yes.
Of course, we're still dealing with the pandemic. So the pandemic also has a lot of parents worrying about kids returning to in-person learning, especially after struggling with all the isolation during the pandemic. Maida, what kind of issues are you seeing surrounding the pandemic and going back to school? And how can parents help their kids thrive in-person school one more time?
Well, I would say, to kind of piggyback on what Dr. Gill was saying, as caregivers, we do set the tone in the house for what those conversations look like and our behaviors and what children will model as well. Across the board, I hear different types of concerns about, yes, the vaccine is available, but schools might not be mandating using masks anymore. Personal choices that are being made, children that have been isolated for quite some time to have to be integrated into school. I mean, even my 4-year-old right now hesitates to be in social settings because she's a COVID baby.
Yeah.
So how do we need to begin to have these conversations, like Dr. Gill said early on, where we're creating safe spaces for our children. And depending on the age too, children or teenagers may not have the language, and we shouldn't technically be trying to be waiting around for them to come to us. We need to make that approach, and what kind of language should we be using would be non-judgmental language, stating things that I see this, I'm concerned about this, I'm coming from a place of love, and being able to also be transparent with your child about what is happening in the world, so that they're aware of that as well, and what are you doing as a family to move forward in that, whether it's at home, your community, your school, what do we do as a unit so that we continue to live our lives productively and in a healthy way.
Yeah, kind of like working, everybody has to kind of work together when it comes to all of this, right? I was thinking about one of the things that one of our parents commented. So I want to step back a little bit and talk about parents and some of the personal and cultural challenges they might have when talking about mental health. So of course, we've already touched on this. Janella says that she lives in a majority Black neighborhood on the South Side, and she has asked, what can you do to help make me, my kids, and my grandkids feel comfortable talking about mental health? So Dr. Gill, you kind of mentioned it a little bit, but maybe what would you say to Janella on this topic?
Right. So I think culturally, African Americans have a lot of oral traditions. And so I would start with reflecting upon generationally what have been the strengths in that family. And if there are narratives that stretch across generations in terms of children should be seen and not heard, or we don't talk outside of our house. Those may be cultural norms that go back generations, to really talk about the harm that could come from those messages, but also how the timing and a sense of safety might have created a necessity to have those values endorsed. And what are the norms that you want to establish for your family in current times that match school community, that match cultural norms and values, and then really establishing what are your expectations in terms of developing a healthy, safe, nurturing relationship in your family in order to keep those norms and values going. I think it's important to think about, you don't toss away your cultural traditions, but really give yourself and your children the opportunity to think about what should we infuse, and then what should we maybe think about as part of our history.
Yeah, that's a great point. And Myra, you already touched on this a little bit, but you're serving a large Latino population in and around Humboldt Park. And I know you talked previously about cultural stigmas around mental health. How would you approach when this happens? You know, how do I talk to my kid about mental health?
You know, in the Latino community, talking about mental health disorders, illnesses, it's still very taboo. There's a lot of these assumptions that one is weak-minded, or it's all in your mind, it's all in your brain. Don't think about it. And one of the things that I strongly suggest and that we offer here in the community are mental health first aid trainings that we offer twice a month at Association House of Chicago, and that is at no cost to the community. And it's an opportunity for people to come to our agency and take this course where you're learning about signs and symptoms. You're learning about how do I approach someone that I care about, that I'm concerned about, because these are the things that I see. And what kind of language do I use in that approach? Because being more educated and having the knowledge is going to lower that stigma, lower that bias, and change things from a cultural aspect, so that our families can become healthier. And we have plenty of parents who attend this course who walk away having a better understanding of how am I going to approach my child now, because I see things differently now.
Yeah, just those having that language. And of course, we know that these things happen like in the Latino and Black community, where it's like, well, if you're depressed, just be happy, right? Or just do something that makes you happy. Like, just kind of like this easy overgeneralization of approaching some of these mental health issues that we've seen, which we probably have all heard previously. So for parents who are, like Myra, you said earlier, that the kids are maybe showing some types of signs, maybe they're not acting like they usually do. They notice something is maybe not right. How can they get help for their kids, right? So how can they get help from professionals if they need it? So a question we got from many, many parents in our survey was, what mental health resources are available for my kid and how can I access them? Dr. Gill, how do you even start, right? If a parent feels that they need to get help, what do they do?
Right. So I think it's important to think about who is in your support system and really starting at the basic level. Who are the caring adults that help to keep your child safe in their community? So whether that's a teacher or a pastor, starting those dialogues with people, after school program providers that can have a basic level of helping them through their day-to-days. But if you are noticing some mental health distress, you might want to seek out a pediatrician, or at your school, there may be a school counselor, a social worker, a school psychologist. And then at an even different level, if a child is in crisis, you may want to think about some of the more established crisis lines. I believe that you all are going to share some resources at the end that indicate some local and some national crisis lines, crisis text. And so those are some resources that can get you going. And if you are fortunate enough to be one of the people in our community that has health insurance, you can always follow up with your health insurance provider, asking more questions about how to access mental health services. Sometimes people have the access, but not necessarily the knowledge about how to go about implementing that, or starting out, reaching out, getting on a waiting list. And sometimes it takes persistence and tenacity to get that. And it should not be easier to do negative coping things than to do the positive ones. But we hope that parents stay encouraged and just keep at it until the help is received.
Great. Those are all great suggestions. Myra, what about you? What kind of advice do you have for parents that are maybe looking for professional help for their child?
What Dr. Gill suggested, what is your
Ditto,
support
right?
system? Yes, what is your support system? What does your network look like? Your school's behavioral health team consists of psychologists and nurses, counselors, social workers, and they can assist the family in the support that they need for their children or that child. And clinicians in schools can help connect families to local healthcare providers. There's also suicide and crisis lifelines. Here at Association House of Chicago, we have our income support services that can assist families with applying for the medical card. So there is a variety of things, but I think it's also just that, not necessarily knowing where to start. And also that pressure of feeling like you have to do that on your own. So really taking a look at who is supportive in your neighborhood, within your home, and kind of doing that together and being able to ask questions and let someone know that you need help, because in Brown and Black communities, it can be difficult to ask for help, to reach out to someone to say, I need assistance with this. And we need to start to change that as well.
Yeah. And then also, once people maybe ask for help, then it gets really hard or complicated to continue moving forward, right? So finding that support system is really important. As we mentioned, we are compiling a mental health resource online at WBEZ.org/mental health. That's where you can go to find health resources. In a couple of weeks, this will also be available in Spanish. And Dr. Gill, you kind of mentioned it, but we also want to acknowledge that many parents that we talked to spoke about the challenges that they've encountered trying to get professional help due to the long waiting list. So you mentioned that earlier, just a lack of general mental health care in the area. Dr. Gill, what advice do you have for parents who do encounter this? They have to get on a wait list, or they, it's kind of complicated to move forward.
Yes. So a couple of things. One, starting with your, primary care provider, your pediatrician, finding out, is there someone in their network that they can connect them to inside of the hospital or the clinic that you are receiving? That might be the closest way to get that accomplished. It's not uncommon to have to sign up for waiting lists and be on several waiting lists. Some clinics may also provide special programs for families that are on the waiting list. And so that is helpful. At the Center for Childhood Resilience, where I work at Lurie, we value going out into schools and really in community spaces, really talking about mental health access and making programs accessible to youth so that they don't have to focus as much about coming into community clinics, but really thinking about, can you start with where kids naturally exist? So can you start within your school system? And I know we'll probably talk about that with Chicago Public Schools a bit later, but Myra did mention behavioral health teams. And so if a school has a behavioral health team where they have this multidisciplinary team where they're able to bring people together to find out what are the needs of a student who's having trouble in school, that will be helpful. And it's another way to kind of get around the wait list. And it doesn't mean that they don't need additional support later on, but it starts that process and doesn't leave parents feeling so helpless. And also is a great way and a great resource to get people services in their natural environment.
Yeah, it's a great point. Myra, do you have anything to add with regards to just maybe the things that you kind of see that commonly kind of are in the way when people are trying to access some of these services?
I mean, in the way of getting the services, I think, again, it's not having the knowledge, not necessarily knowing where to start or the access to things, or not necessarily always being aware of what may exist. And again, touching on individuals that can help with that, like the behavioral health team at a school, speaking to a pastor, going to your local organizations and trying to get more information. Unfortunately, you do get put in a place sometimes where you do have to consistently advocate for yourself and do a lot more work than it should have to be. But when we're talking about mental health disorders in young people, you want to tackle things early. You don't want to wait for years to go by, and then you're trying to figure out things later into teenage years or adulthood, because the earlier you start with treatment or whatever that looks like for that child, because treatment looks different for different people, I think that families need to walk away understanding that recovery is possible, that we need to be able to communicate to our children that this is not their fault, that they did not somehow manifest this, and that they're not alone in this journey. Because we have to try to think too, what are children thinking? What are they experiencing internally? And they need to be able to feel supported by their caregivers.
So glad you mentioned that. Definitely. Well, I think those are great tips for our parents and for those listening. I want to finish the segment with a quick lightning round of sorts. So I'll be asking this to all the panelists tonight. We know that CPS starts school on Monday, if you believe it or not. And if you could give Chicago parents one brief bit of homework, for say, to help keep their kids mentally healthy this school year, what would that be? So giving parents a little bit of homework. What would you say, Dr. Gill?
Well, I would say start early. I know it's Monday, practicing getting ready for school. So start putting those devices away, giving some restrictions and limits on social media and bedtime helps to really get your mind and body ready for learning.
Great. What about you, Myra?
I would say to be very intentional about setting time aside to spend time with your child, and that time be relaxing, and very intentional about quality time where it's quiet and an opportunity to talk about whatever you want to talk about, but that it's also relaxing. I would say being intentional about setting that time.
Those are great, right? Because we're always just rushing around and like all the to-do lists, and it's very hectic sometimes. Wow, that was great. Thank you, Myra and Dr. Gill, for sharing the insight and a little bit of your time. We're going to see Dr. Gill again later in the discussion. We're going to bring her back. But now it's time to talk with our other two guests. Thank you so much, Myra. Thank you so much, Dr. Gill.
Thank you so
Thank you, Araceli.
All right, we're going to talk about what parents and students should know about mental health support in Chicago schools this summer. So Catherine Whitfield Martin is a principal at Charles Sumner Math and Science Community Academy in Lawndale. I hope I got that right. And before she started in education, Catherine was a social worker. So hello, how are you?
Hello, how are you? Thanks for having me.
Great. And we also have Brian Coleman. Brian is a counselor at Jones College Prep in Printers Row, where he leads the counseling department. And Brian is also serving as president of the Illinois School Counselor Association. Thank you for joining us. And remember, if you want to hear questions from our panel, drop a comment on YouTube or wherever you're listening, and we will include. Thanks, Brian, for being here.
Thank you for having me.
All right, let's get to it. We're going to spend this segment talking about what's available inside schools to help kids, to help keep kids mentally healthy and learning. We got a comment. Jane on the Southeast side asks, how can school support of mental health be embedded into their everyday curriculum without students having to seek help? Now, this is very proactive, right? Principal Barton, what do you think we can do to help understand what is social emotional learning and some other approaches that are happening in the classroom already?
Yeah, I'm very excited about the growth that's happened within our district over the last couple of years. It has tremendously, with me sitting from a social worker lens, and sometimes it was 10 years ago, feeling like I was in isolation. It's finally like all the puzzle pieces came together, where it actually is a district priority to really focus on the emotional well-being of our students. And the Office of Social Emotional Learning has become a really true powerhouse within resources that are extended to schools that previously principals like myself may have to pay for or navigate. They are really working to make it easier for those of us on the front lines to support families that are presenting with needs, but then also just set up all of the level 1 procedures that every student should be able to receive. So when you talk about social emotional learning, I like to think about it's all those soft skills that you learn, like how to be kind, how to accept negative feedback and not turn into the Tasmanian devil, how to smile and respond appropriately, all those things that you kind of expect for kids to just learn, and we learn them, but it's at varying degrees, right? So there's the expectation within the district that schools are incorporating social emotional learning standards that are tied to ISB into our daily work with students. And there's core curriculums that are available to us by virtue of the district with the Office of Social Emotional Learning that we're able to provide to our kiddos. So for instance, Second Step is a research-based curriculum that lives and breathes within the daily experiences of students, and is facilitated by teachers and partner with counselors, that it really teaches kids all those soft skills. But more importantly, it creates a space to have conversations about how we discuss our feelings, how do we discuss when we're frustrated in a productive way, right? So I would say for the parent that called, there's a lot of entry points that the district is providing to schools that I think for those of us like Brian and myself that are counselors, we come with like this knowledge and excitement, and that's why we work at schools. But had I not been in a mental health background and I was just like a teacher who had matriculated, it would be very difficult, right, for me to understand absent the district support for this work.
Yeah, Brian, in your career, have you seen that change, or do you see the difference between maybe, a newer staff member or someone who's been there for a long time to kind of, talk about curriculum and social emotional learning in the school systems?
Yes, I definitely see a difference. I often talk with parents and guardians about think back to when you were a kid. Were you having conversations about mental health or social emotional wellness? What did that look like for you if there was something like that in your experience? And then that helps to appreciate when you were little, we're now grown, right? And we are the people in our schools working who didn't have necessarily those experiences, that education and curriculum around social emotional learning and health and wellness. So it's very, very common for folks to be a little anxious or nervous about engaging in the work. But I do absolutely agree that I think the district is offering a lot of great supports, tools, and resources. And I think there's just a lot of empowerment about these conversations. I love what the parent is saying, like, how can we be proactive? How can we be a part of this full experience? Like, we're empowering our school staff, our teachers, our counselors, our social workers, our nurses, our administrators, right? Our security to have meaningful conversations with our students and with each other and with our staff. And we are talking and naming feelings. We're naming that we're taking a trauma-informed perspective on what our students are going through. All of this, I think, is really leading and pushing a conversation and interventions that are for the betterment of our students.
Oh, wow. And Brian, we talked earlier about the different cultural attitudes towards mental health when it comes to your, cultural backgrounds. And we got several questions and comments from parents about how Black and Latino children should be taught about mental health. What should a culturally sensitive approach to social emotional learning look like?
I think a lot of it starts with meeting your students and families where they are, right? Hearing in their words and their language. When we talk about mental health, when I say mental health, what does that mean to you?
Yeah.
When we talk about stress, when we talk about coping strategies, what are healthy coping strategies that we're aware of? Or what are some that may not be so healthy? We're talking about depression, anxiety. It's about finding shared language, common language, and awareness and building up. And I think it's about really helping families understand, because schools can be really complicated spaces. A lot of different stakeholders do a lot of different things, and it can be very difficult from outside the school to really understand. Learning how is your school set up, who are the stakeholders that support mental health and wellness. If you have questions or you're concerned about your child, where do you go? But I think it's about really normalizing that these conversations can happen, normalizing that schools or spaces are supports to the families. So many families feel sometimes disenfranchised by schooling, their own experiences, or engaging with schools for their children. It's about reaching out, finding who your support players are, and normalizing that trusting, collaborative relationship that's so important. I heard earlier the school as the extension of the family, and I think that is so meaningful. The school as the extension of the community, I think, is really important.
Yeah, I think that there's a lot of times there's like a lot of lingo, right, that happens in schools, and somebody that from the outside, doesn't really know what's happening, and it could be a little confusing when we're talking about counselors, social workers, therapists, and these are all available in schools. And some people, I feel like, use them interchangeably, like if they were the same. So, Brian, you're a counselor, and Principal
Yes.
Martin, you've been a licensed clinical social worker. So, can you talk a little bit about Principal Martin? We'll start with you. Like, talk about the differences in those roles and what that means, so that our parents know a little bit of the lingo.
I think you should think about a social worker that's solely focused on the mental well-being of your student and a resource getter, right? So social workers, we're used to figuring out, like, what do you need, and then how do I connect you with a resource that's going to be able to provide you with ongoing counseling services. They're going to be able to fill in a gap because you're saying there might be some issues with food necessity or housing. Like, the social workers, we're all about fixers. Like, so what do we need to do to kind of fix the immediate situation, and then provide you with the resources for when you need additional counseling. There's counseling that social workers can provide one-to-one individual services within CPS buildings, but they're typically allocated to students by virtue if they have an individual education plan or an IEP. So you have social workers that, per the student's individualized plan, I'm working with Catherine on this goal and we're evaluating it, and parents are part of the creation of the plan and those minutes. That doesn't mean that you won't have access to that school social worker if there's an immediate, an emergency issue, but just so families can understand when language about, like, well, caseload, or she's not here every day, there's this language that comes up.
Yeah.
So that's what I would say the biggest difference is about social workers and how we function within Chicago public schools.
Yeah. And can you explain what IEPs are for people who don't know?
So an individual education plan is a legal document that really is, I'm smiling because it's like the blueprint to how your student learns best, right? And there's these individuals that are invested in seeing your child thrive, that are coming together at a table, and they're have kind of looked at her like, okay, we're noticing that she might need some more support in math. These are the goals that she's going to have, and she does better in a small setting for that. So let's say she's supposed to be in math 60 minutes every day. For 20 of those minutes, we're going to pull her out every day to work in a smaller setting. Again, none of these things should be happening to kids and happening to parents. There are meetings and documentation and notifications of meetings and calls that accompany this. So the parents play a very pivotal role and should feel, I would definitely urge to feel like you should be advocating for your children, asking questions in those meetings, stopping the table and saying, I don't get what you're saying, when it's an opportunity for us to revisit that. And I think sometimes I would definitely say at those tables, it can be intimidating, but know that as school professionals, we're really working in the best interest of your child, right? So know that I know for my team and every school that I've been in, and I can speak for everybody in district, like it's really hard work. So the folks that are here because we have a heart for kids and we have a heart for families. So I really would hope that families can lean into that. But ask questions, ask a lot of questions, and stop the process and say, hey, can you explain this?
Yeah, definitely. Brian, what about you? Any tips for parents who are navigating, maybe trying to figure out when do they talk to a counselor? When do they talk to a social worker? Things like that.
Yeah, I think, well, one big thing is that it can vary so widely from school to school. Not every school
Oh,
has a combination of the school counselor, the social worker, the psychologist, the case managers. When we're talking about IEPs, the folks who
mhm.
support the scheduling and crafting of these legal documents. So it's first really important to understand who exists and how do they describe the work that they're doing. When I talk about counseling and I think about counseling work, broadly, I think of us not as fixers, but we're liaisons with hands in a lot of different pots. Like there's the
Mhm.
academic support piece. We're not the teachers, but we do a lot of tertiary skill development work with students, or graduation requirements and scheduling and all those pieces. There's the social emotional piece where we overlap pretty greatly with social work. School counselors tend to do more of the tier one, the all school, all students when it comes to academic supports and social emotional support. And then a big difference hits with post-secondary planning, right? What do students want to do? What skills do they need to get where they want to go? Talking about careers, how does post-secondary education factor into the goals that students are setting for themselves? So broadly, that's where school counseling is. But I also appreciate that our schools look different. The school counselors also tend to be staff that are full-time at the school. Our school social workers, our school psychologists sometimes float between schools, right? So when I'm thinking about counselors, I think it's so helpful for parents to consider counselors as like that first line of customer service. If you don't know where to start, you don't know who's doing what. Well, if your school's got a counselor, you can at least start their questions there. And if they're not the direct service provider, they can connect you to the people that are.
Yeah, so ask those questions. And we got a lot of comments and questions about this, right? Like which schools have what and how do you know? And really the inequity of some of the resources that some schools have that others don't. So we have a slide available, and it really takes a look at this 2021 analysis of school counselors by Chalkbeat Chicago. So let's see if we have that. If not, we can talk about it. There it is. All right. So, Chalkbeat found that the city's majority Latino schools, the average elementary school counselor is responsible for 501 students. And in schools with more than 80% of students that are Latino, the caseload goes up to 665. There are some schools in Chicago where one counselor is responsible for more than 1,000 students. So the recommended ratio is 250 students to one counselor, and that's the guideline from the American School Counselors Association. So according to this report from Chalkbeat, the average caseload for a counselor in Illinois is 626 students. So that's the state, and the fourth highest average caseload in the country. And when we look at majority Black schools in Chicago, we can see that counselor caseload actually decreased the more Black students at a school. So Chalkbeat points out that it's likely to decline due to declining enrollment in some of the city's majority Black schools. These are things that people talk about. A lot of parents talk about who's available, what's not available at my school. Brian, can you shed a little bit of light on your workload as a counselor and perhaps share what you've heard from other school counselors dealing with a higher volume of students, right?
I mean, what I've heard more than anything is how overwhelmed people feel with the amount of students that they are supporting, students and families that they're supporting. That is extremely challenging work. that's why I think it's really important for counselors to be strategic in the interventions and the programming that they provide. We use language, you might hear the tiered language, tier 1, tier 2, tier 3. That can be inaccessible for families. But when I say tier 1, I'm talking about the supports that reach all of our students, right? So that's when the curriculum that counselors provide, because we're all about supporting mindsets and behaviors around social emotional learning and academic preparation and college and career readiness for students. So getting into the classroom, partnering with our teachers, making sure that we're able to get information to students quickly and a lot of students at once, because when you have 500, 600 students that you're working with, seeing each of them individually is really complicated, if not impossible to do. And depending on the way your school is structured or the allocation of time and what the council, whether or not the counselor is participating in non-counseling duties based on the staffing at the school and what the needs are, you might end up spending a lot of time in responsive services and that crisis work. And that might be all the counselor is able to do, right? It really just depends on the environment. But I think more than anything, the weight of that many people per one counselor is just, it's really difficult. So as we talked about earlier a little bit, it's about having those community partnerships, right? What resources exist to help lessen that burden, because that's a lot.
Yes. Yeah. And a lot of our parents in the survey really just wanted to say, like, asked for more resources to be available. And we got several questions, like one from Kiara from Coleman, who asks, why are the resources for elementary schools not equal across the board? So, Principal Martin, do you want to start with your thoughts? Like, why does this happen?
My pause is that a lot of times it's the squeaky wheel gets the oil, right? And I think that when you have different admin in the seat and they're coming to a school community, they're trying to navigate what relationships are there. And I'm very thankful for the background that I have, because I come to what Brian says, like, even if you have 2 counselors, even if you have they cannot do it alone. You have to rely on community partners and community relationships to be able, and that's how I kind of lead it. I want to be able to support a student when they show up with whatever the need may be. And I want to have a resource or at least a community partner that connect with the parent, whatever the need may be. So I think that you really have to have that lens to go in with that. However, what I'll say now, that's the work that the Office of Social Emotional Learning is doing for us. And under the new leadership, they're impressing upon us that they want to be the ones to go out and identify those community partners and have them already on a list so that school leaders can just link with them, as opposed to, by virtue of me being a social worker, I know how to muddle through the things and figure it out, because I know I work in the best of figuring it out for my families. However, everyone does not have the capacity to do that. That's why I'm so thankful that as a district, they're recognizing that gap and providing those resources to us. And yes, there have been, unfortunately, there's been years where there's been inequitable funding to schools and inequitable access to resources. However, I will say that there have been some additional funding provided to school called equity money, based on the percentage of students in a certain zip code and the Japanese, all of these things that I know from my particular community I've benefited from, right? So it's allowed me to be able to increase the amount of resources and smaller class sizes and provide community partners for one-on-one services within my building. So I hear that parent. I give her tons of optimism though, because I can see the change and the shift in the district to create more equity for the allocation of resources.
Okay. And given what's available in schools, I think we should spend a little time, now talking about how parents should go about advocating for their child within the school system. So we talked a little bit about lingo and all of that, but we got an anonymously submitted question that reads, it would be helpful to know what is reasonable to expect in terms of being in contact with the teacher. I often find myself wondering where the lines are between advocating for my child, expecting too much, and expecting too little, and what are reasonable things to reach out about versus things to just accept, right? So I think I know a lot of people kind of, do I send the email? Do I not send the email? Brian, let's start with you. What do you think about this?
Oof. Well, I have a lot of different feelings partnering with teachers. Where I hear about the do they send it, do they not? How do we engage? I think that anxiety exists on both ends. I come from the school of over communication. Reach out. There in far too many school communities. There's not enough communication between our parents and guardians and caregivers and our staff and teachers, counselors, etc. So I think some of the things that first come to me, it's about relationships. Counseling is about relationship. All of our roles in education are about relationships, and I think it's so important for parents to engage in that relationship development with teachers early on in the year. I'm sure there's the back to school night experience, or teachers reach out with an overview of the year and how they plan to support and how they want to engage with parents and guardians. So hearing from teachers and hearing from school staff how they want you to engage when it comes, like, we're talking about your children and their education, and so you taking some engagement in that is absolutely appropriate. But I especially think as your children develop and are getting older, that there's an increase in accountability and students' ability to self-advocate, and that they're able to take a more active role in advocating for themselves. But that comes back to social emotional learning. Are we teaching our students those skills? Are we normalizing their role in their educational experiences? But I think reaching out is absolutely appropriate. If you want to check in on, I think a great first question is, teacher, staff member, counselor, social worker, how can I support you in the work you're doing with my child? Right. And that, I think, is so great to hear on the school end, because it immediately starts from a place of collaboration and not accusation.
See, these are the great tips. That's what, like, put it in your drafts already now. Principal Martin, do you have anything to add about that?
Yeah, I was just going to add to that as a dovetail, also sharing if you know there were strategies that work best with your child from even a previous teacher, sharing that with that teacher. So, my son learns best with like positive affirmations, or when the teacher gave him an area in the classroom where he can kind of just come and sit and cool out for 5 minutes, he's ready to go. I think that kids come to school. I just did a training with my staff today, and I was talking about this invisible backpack that they have, right? And there's all types of things in their invisible backpack. There's the experiences that they've had about school before they've gotten there. There's experiences that they've had about teachers. It's what they saw on the way to school. It's what their parents have experienced and impressed upon them. And it's for us as adults to be able to refill that backpack sometimes with a lot of positive experiences to counteract sometimes those negative experiences. And I share that because we have to do that same work with parents who have a level of distrust because of their negative experiences. So for this parent, I would encourage her in advocating to say, hey, these are some ways that my son gets excited with learning. Is this something you can incorporate with your class? And I would say ask. A lot of schools have communication portals. We use Snap Connect at our school. So just asking, like, is there a communication portal? Is there email? I just want to make sure I can stay in the know. And then also asking what the teacher's cadence is for reaching out. She may say like, hey, we get progress reports every 5 weeks. You'll definitely hear from me every 5 weeks. No news is good news. Or she'll say, I'll try to reach out with a positive comment every week. So really asking what is her baseline, or his or her baseline for providing information, so that the parent can kind of like know, okay, well, I know that I'm only going to hear from them every 4 weeks. Let me be the one to initiate some more comments. I will also say for parents, in terms of just looping in for the communication and about grades, CPS has Parent Portal where you're able to see your students' grades on your phone. It's an app on your phone. You can download it. The front office can help you in navigating that. I've helped that with parents. So you're able to see how my students are already doing with their grades, what are the missing work, and even if there are attendance concerns, right? And then you can use that data as a point of conversation to have with the teacher. Like, I'm noticing that there are some missing assignments. Can you let me know if this is something that he's going to make up in class, or is it something I need to work with at home? Just the more details that you can give will help, because we have to be mindful that teachers are showing up and they're honestly doing their best. And we love all our kids, but your child is special to them and special to you, but it's one of potentially 30 kids, right? So how are you really recognizing, let me give her some details and figure out what my takeaway needs to be to best support my child.
Yeah, and to zoom in a little bit more, Principal Martin, we talked when planning for this, you spoke about the distrust that some parents have in government entities. And so we have to, kind of think about all the long histories of disinvestment and systemic racism and generational trauma. So a quick tip for a parent who's maybe coming from that, wearing that invisible backpack, right? What would you say to them?
I would say that a deep breath is always helpful. And really having in mind, what do you want the outcome of the conversation to be? And leading with that. So, like, hey, I'm here because I'm struggling because I feel like I don't know what's going on with my child. Like, how are you clear about what you really are looking for in the conversation? Because sometimes, and everybody has their own trauma, how it manifests in the main office when your needs aren't being met really shuts other people down, right? So just going on and leading, like, this is a concern I have. Who can I speak with? And if you're not taken to a private area, ask, like, because especially in elementary school setting, the front office is like Grand Central Station. So ask if someone should be taking you to another area, like, is there somewhere else I can speak quiet? Because then that just de-escalates the whole situation. But really leading with what are you looking for to get, and what is the outcome that you need? What are you hoping to get? And that will help whomever you're speaking with to kind of like know where they need to direct you. And really being open that, like, everyone that's working in schools, especially right now when there is a nationwide teacher, staff, everyone that is connected with the school shortage, those of us that are still in the game and showing up, like, we are dedicated to this work. Like, I'm getting chills just saying that. Like, we are wearing our hearts on our sleeves for your kid and our kids and our community. So know that we're invested in this work because we're still here.
Great, thank you. And we do have a question from our audience. So a reminder to the audience, if you have a question, please drop it below. So we have somebody watching. Christina asks, as a parent with a teenager already diagnosed with anxiety and MDD, how do we get them more active in all the available resources that may be provided in our neighborhoods without the teen feeling the pressure? So maybe, Brian, you can take this one. Do you have any thoughts on any suggestions on what she could do?
I think first, it's really important to talk to your child and get a sense of what they are open to, what they are comfortable doing, engaging, and seeing if you can meet them halfway. I know as a counselor and often in conversation with parents, I often feel like the pressure to make the decisions for students, but I think that is not particularly appropriate, especially once we're getting into high school. I think it's about what are the interests? What are your students' interests? Are there through the school clubs and activities that they might be interested in engaging in? What are the options in your community in terms of activities? And let's start the conversation. Here are some options. Here's a menu of options. What makes sense for you? And then I like the idea of giving your student an entry point that makes sense to them. Maybe it's not going to this activity and engaging 5 days a week, every week. Maybe it's, you know what? In the next few months, let's try at least going to a meeting. Let's go to that one club meeting and let's see, right? Getting a little bit of that exposure, because we're talking about, I think with MDD, we're talking about major depressive disorder, right? And progress monitoring over time. More than anything, I think it's about normalizing a regular check-in point with your students around how they're doing, how they're feeling, right? And how can you support? And sometimes I hear students say all the time, well, my mama told me I have to do, or my mama said, and did. Well, that is true, right? And your
Yeah.
parents have a huge investment in your experience and your education, but letting your child lead a bit about what are they willing to engage in and how can you continue to progress monitor their growth over time.
Great advice. And before we wrap up, I do want to touch a little bit on CPS students and if they're English language learners or if their parents are foreign born and Spanish is their preferred language. Understanding that parents must, they're not completely sure how to use the language properly and or even know anything about mental health. So Brian, any suggestions on somebody who's listening right now who English is their second language? What can they do when it comes to getting support for their child?
I think step one is to connect with school and make it clear that you want to support. Schools don't know what they don't know in terms of what families may need. And there's so many tools and resources that we don't expect you to figure out yourself. Right? We are a large district with a lot of tools and resources, but we can also be very compartmentalized, right? The larger it gets, it can be more difficult to navigate. So to reach out, and I think this is true, and I remember Principal Whitfield Martin talking about it a little bit, it's just about, can you be open with the school about what your struggles are. And when we talk about the trust issues that exist, that's very, very real. And we are in part asking you to be vulnerable, to be open with, this is a concern I have, or here's a trauma that I've experienced and why I don't really want to talk to you and I don't want to engage. The more information that a school has, then they can meet you where you are. But we have to first know where you are, which means we have to first know you.
So talking, are there any, do the schools talk about mental health to the parents? Because like sometimes the students are very well aware of what kind of issues, and they have maybe the language, but maybe the parents don't know, right? So is there any help there to kind of connect that bridge?
I think so, and it will vary from school to school. I recommend that you take a look and see, is there a parent guardian association or organization at your school that you can tap into? Coming back to that theme that you're not alone, you do not have to do this alone. And I think it's really beholden on schools to offer that information and that awareness for families on mental health. What are we doing at school? What community resources exist? And how do we work together to support your children? That is definitely something that both sides need to be working together on, but it does require engaging in and seeing what, like as we talked about, what's that cadence of contact? What are the, like when I think about back to school nights or report card pickup, these wonderful opportunities to go to school or to engage with school and have that relationship time, talk about what issues or concerns you have, because it can be very difficult otherwise to maybe get to school and to engage in that way.
Yeah, definitely. And before we wrap up, the last question of the segment is going to be the homework question that I gave to our earlier panelists, right? So a homework question for parents, and this is for both of you. We'll start with you, Principal Martin. If you could give Chicago parents one accessible, easy kind of tip for them to do to make sure that their kids are happy and mentally healthy, physically healthy in the new school year, what would it be?
Create a space to ask open-ended questions about school. So create a routine that isn't always like, how was school? It was fine. I always push the conversation with our kids. Okay, tell me 3 things that are good about it. Like you have to pull it out so that those are like little nuggets that they're giving you so that you also have a baseline for when things vary. So if a student is consistently saying every day, like, I'm loving math, then how can you push into that math teacher and let them know, like, hey, my child is loving math. I just want to let you know that. Or if you're noticing that grade is dropping, then like, hey, my child started out loving math. I'm noticing that their grade is dropping. Can you let me know what's going on? So I would say just that excitement for the school year and really being incessant. Sometimes I've even found as the kids get older, some parents start pulling back. And I would say to even start more pushing in. Because then you want to be in their business even more so that you can keep an eye on them making the best decisions as they're given a little bit more autonomy. So I would just offer that, be as excited about school, display that excitement for them. We're so excited to receive them and have them back in school on Monday. I'm doing a lot of work at the district and individually within our schools for that, but just create that routine of asking the questions and asking for the details and being like a nosy parent. Like, just
Oh, so many times where it's like, how was school? Good. What did you do? Right. Nothing.
Peel the onion. Peel the onion.
Yeah, that was great. Brian, what about you? Tips or one thing that take away?
Just one. I have like 3. Is it okay if I give you like 3? All right. So I absolutely think the check-in is really, really important in coming up with a model that you can continue to check in with your student. We talk about being nosy parents, being up in your kids' business, be up in your school's business, right? I think if I had one tip, it's learn the landscape of your school. Who are your support players? Does your school have a counselor? Does your school have a social worker, a school psychologist, a school nurse? Who does what? Who's supposed to be your initial point of contact? Is there a parent and guardian association that you can tap into? Know the layout so you can leverage that. These supports exist, but it can be really hard, especially as we're in the throes of the school year. And if you're a parent that thinks, you know what, my kid, right? And then when something happens, I hate to be in a situation where families were like, well, what do I do now, right? Let's do some of that preventative work by knowing what supports exist. If I have an issue or concern, if I'm worried, what steps do I take? Let's get that information as early into the school year as possible.
Thank you. And we could talk about this for much longer, but unfortunately that we've ran out of time for this section. Thank you very much, Brian and Catherine, for joining us and sharing all of that. A lot of really great tips. Thanks again.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
All right. So let's talk about stress. Okay, there's a lot of stress out there. Our next panelists are both experts in helping children and teens process difficult emotions and experiences. So if you have any questions about that, stress, anxiety, we're already getting some on the chat. Don't forget to let us know. And of course, we will ask our panelists. So leave us a comment wherever you're watching and we'll do the best to answer it. So I'd like to bring back Dr. Tara Gill one more time back to the screen. She's a psychologist and mental health consultant at the Center for Childhood Resilience at Lurie Children's Hospital. And joining Dr. Gill, we're going to have Lucia del Rincon Martinez. And Lucia is a trauma therapist at the Chicago Childhood Trauma Center at the Rabida Children's Hospital. Lucia and Dr. Gill, thank you for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Welcome back, Dr. Gill. You weren't far. We brought you back. Okay, so let's talk a little bit about what's happened in the past few years. It's safe to say that we were all very stressed. There's obviously some type of trauma as well as a result of the pandemic. We are living through moments of gun violence. There's climate change. There's systemic racism. These are all things that we are living through, right? So let's talk about how kids are dealing with all of this. One of our parents, Brett, living in Irving Park, asked, how much will children be able to process all of the violence and the confusion in the world? And is it different than what we've had in previous generations and what they've had to process, right? So we kind of hear a lot about those comparisons. Lucia, question for you, what have you seen when helping children understand some of these stressful things?
Yeah, I think it's hard to compare to different generations, obviously, but I do think the one thing this generation has is like a lot of media exposure, right? Like kids are online, kids are seeing things that maybe other generations didn't have as much access to. So I think monitoring what that input looks like for your kid is really important. And I think in terms of processing that, being open to having those conversations with your kid is really important at like an age appropriate level, depending on what age your child is at. Is also important because I think when we don't have those conversations doesn't mean those kids don't have questions about them. It just means that their questions aren't being answered, right?
Yeah. Sometimes I think that especially younger children, like parents are like, well, they are not aware of what's happening. So, how do you navigate that? What do you tell parents when they're kind of maybe thinking that?
Yeah, I think kids are always smarter than we give them credit to be, right? So kids are listening when you have the TV on, like, kids hear through doors, kids walk by living rooms, right? So like kids are hearing those things and have access to that media. Maybe you're not even giving them access to it, but they're hearing about it at school, right? They're coming home with that information. Their friends are telling them, right? So I think even when you think like there's no way my child heard about what happened, chances are they might have. So it's worth asking those questions to make sure you're checking in on your child.
Dr. Gill, how do you know when is the appropriate time to bring it up or to talk about it, especially when you don't know how much your kid is understanding the severity of all of these issues that are happening? Oh, we can't hear you.
Darn. So I think it's really important to normalize talking time with your children. So whether that is the car ride, it's a lovely place for kids to feel kind of not seen but heard, so that they can just kind of talk to you at the back of your head. But it's something about that feels safe. Having dinner table time. If you're eating in different places, maybe think about bringing your family together for dinner, if not every night, several nights per week. And I think that creating that safe space within your home facilitates dialogue to the point that it's just normal to talk about things, current events, news, so that when the current event is something that is more volatile, more difficult to fathom or to talk about, there's some practice, there's some exposure, there's language to go with that. And just I think that it's parents' natural inclination to protect their children, but it's hard to protect your children in a bubble. So if it's happening in the world, your protection really says more about the messages that you feel versus protecting them from the actual information. So don't overexpose. You don't want to leave the TV running on CNN for 12 hours right after a significant scary event, but you do want to think about what is the age appropriate messages that I can talk to my child about. And sometimes it's with children's books, sometimes it's with reading the paper, and then sometimes it's with tying things back to generational narratives, thinking about what's happening right now with, say, for example, systemic racism is similar to what happened in the civil rights movement. So helping people to think about we survived that period. And so there's opportunities for us to learn from what we did in the past. And I think that those types of strategies can be really helpful.
Yeah. And on a similar note, you know, we heard from so many parents about school safety concerns and, you know, active shooter drills, and how can those be explained to younger kids? Lydia in Belmont Cragen wants to know, what extra support will students have to have them cope with stress related to school shootings, and what extra support or safety will students have with this issue? Dr. Gill, can you kind of respond to that? I mean, it is a hard topic to talk about.
It is. So schools like CPS have definitely invested resources into, talking about stress in a time when stress is just abundant. I think the list that you described can be overwhelming if you think about all of the things that are happening, and we know that things are always to come. But if we think about the amount of training that has gone into staff to build their capacity to understand trauma, to understand strategies to address trauma within their sphere of influence. So within their classroom, within policy changes, within practice elements like drills and things like that. I think that schools are becoming ready, and adults are becoming ready. Sometimes the families aren't ready and the kids aren't ready, but it's our job to get people all on the same page so that we can respond in the way we need to respond. So those practice elements are really important. And it's important to have emotional and physical safety. So just helping kids to recognize if you're not feeling safe, what can you see in your environment that lets you know that you are safe? And if you don't feel safe and you physically are not safe, what is it that you can do? Who do you reach out to? So I think that as long as people are taking strategies for what to do and how to do it and checking in with themselves about their level of stress, then that's like half the battle.
Yeah. Is there anything you'd like to add, Lucia, when it comes to, understanding this difficult topic for children, especially because, like you mentioned, it's all over the media most of the time?
Yeah, I think to bounce off what Dr. Gill said, like making that time for parents to check in with a friend, with a support system that they have before having that conversation with their child. I think it's like these are really hard topics for everyone. Like it's really hard to see that happening and really scary as a parent. So making sure you're able to have that conversation with your child in like a way where you're emotionally regulated. So making sure you have other spaces to do that so that you can have that conversation with your child and validating your child's feelings about it too, right? Making sure that sometimes we go into this like fix it mode of like, that's never going to happen to us. Whereas we can kind of validate like that is really scary, right? Like what can we do about that? What can we do to make you feel safer in that situation?
Oh, so using that type of language, right? I think that's when we go back to having the language to be able to communicate this. Can you go in a little bit deeper on that? Like give like an example of what is more dismissive and what is more acknowledging, right?
Yeah, I think like validating like a child's emotions and adult emotions too is really underestimated sometimes. I think sometimes we think that kids like really need something from us, and sometimes they just need comfort or validation in that like emotion. And so I think we're quick to try to like solve a problem when sometimes a child just needs to hear like, yeah, that can be really scary, right? Or like sometimes they don't really need answers the way that maybe adults are like, well, what are we going to do about this, right? Like maybe a child's brain isn't going there, maybe it is, but you kind of have to ask and ask what those feelings are in order to know what your child is thinking, right? I think we're quick to assume before we ask.
Yeah, and when we talk about school shootings and how terrifying and looming, the threat is here in the U.S., we also have to think about like there's shootings happening on a regular basis in areas in Chicago, right? So far too many young children have died as a result of community violence here. We had a parent, Janella in Auburn Gresham, say over in our community, Black neighborhoods, in the Black neighborhoods, when a kid sees someone get shot, they need mental health assistance, but where do they go, or how is this, addressed? Lucia, do you want to keep going? Like, how you work with kids regularly who maybe witnessed violence? What are the steps that the parents need to take?
Yeah, so those are definitely a lot of our clients at the trauma center. I think kind of like they were mentioning in that first segment of the panel, checking in on your child's behavior, and if you're seeing any changes, any patterns when those things happen, to indicate that your child is really distressed about what happened. Again, children react to things in different ways. So kind of seeing what's going on there. And then if there are symptoms, if there is an issue, if it is really affecting your child, then going on to seek some kind of mental health treatment is helpful. Like was mentioned before, I think checking in with your school resources, your pediatrician is a good way to start. There are trauma therapists out there like me, right? And those resources do exist. And sometimes kids just need short-term treatment. Sometimes they need long-term treatment. It looks really different for every child. But I think just checking in on your child and then advocating for your child to seek out the resources they need.
Okay, great. And in situations, so stepping a little bit from the gun violence, in situations where children aren't getting the care and support they need at home, now we know this, this forms trauma, especially in young people. We had someone, Kiara in West Pullman, wants to know, are there resources available for elementary students who are dealing with abuse, neglect, trauma from violence in the community or at home? Dr. Gill, what do you have to say about that question?
So I think what the educator, Brian, was mentioning is there's a lot of variability within schools. And I would definitely think that if there is some abuse and neglect, it's likely going to manifest itself in behaviors that will be noticed in a school setting. So thinking about before a child might be even identified in that way, helping to train staff on what to look for and how to make those reports, how to get that declaration. And then once that child has been identified as having that difficulty, there are things like the Children's Advocacy Centers in Chicago that can help to get the youth the services that they need. And then that also, there are, the same way you mentioned, there are different types of therapists in a school, a counselor, a social worker, psychologist. There are also different types of trained therapists in the community. As Dr. Martinez is a trauma therapist. And so that's one way to kind of think about identifying through other means what's the right person to seek out.
Sometimes it's scary for parents who maybe are seeing that their child needs help. And they are like, okay, I know the first step, I'm going to take this first step to seek help. But then they're like, what happens next, right? That what comes next, and how, what would you say to a parent that says, okay, I'm going to reach out, I know where to go, but I'm very, hesitant about what happens after that. Lucia, what tips do you have for parents in that case?
Yeah, I think especially in communities where maybe mental health treatment isn't so normalized, right? Or parents haven't had access to it themselves, it can be really scary to have that happen for the first time, or to go in and tell someone all your issues when that isn't something you've ever done before. So I think just trying to normalize that space for your child and be open to that experience. And like, you're allowed to ask questions, right? You're allowed to ask questions of your providers and ask what treatment looks like, what the different options are. A lot of places have case managers that can kind of point you in the right direction based off of what your needs are, right? So not every type of treatment works for every type of family. Not every therapist is for every family, right? So maybe you don't click with your therapist. Are there other options? I think we're quick to have one experience in mental health care and then chalk up all therapists to be the same way. And that's not always the case, right? So I think just trying to be open to that experience and finding something that works for you and your family. And then if you as an adult are looking for services too, there are also really great services for Black and Brown communities. There's lists of Black and Brown providers. If that's something that feels more comfortable, I think those resources exist. It's just a matter of connecting with them.
Great. And like we mentioned earlier, we will have a resource guide available. Thanks, Lucia, for reminding me of that. And I hope we can get Dr. Gill back. I think she she might have gotten off the call, but hopefully she'll be back. In the meantime, we do have a video question. Somebody sent in a video question for our experts. And it's about the importance of sleep. So this is a very important topic to me. Let's listen to what they had to say if we have that video available.
Hello, I'm Dr. Audrey Stillerman, Integrated Family Doctor and Medical Director of the UIC Miles Square Office of Community Engagement School Health Centers. My work focuses on supporting the mental and physical health of children, teens, and families attending South and West Side public schools. What we've all been through over the last few years has affected our mental health. This spring, I was thrilled to see 2 news articles, Less Sleep, Less Happiness, and We're Ignoring a Major Culprit Behind the Teen Mental Health Crisis, both of which emphasize the importance of sleep as prevention and treatment for mental health problems. Sleep helps us regulate our emotions, moods, and behaviors, pay attention and remember things, repair our muscles, strengthen our immune systems, and prevent and mitigate diseases like diabetes, high blood pressure, and asthma. Good sleep helps us be the best student, athlete, friend, worker, and creator we can be. That said, 60% of middle schoolers, 70% of high schools, and 30% of adults aren't getting enough sleep. Why is this? Well, some children and families are hungry, unhoused, or facing regular abuse and violence. Our culture doesn't value sleep. School starts too early. Youth are overscheduled with homework, activities, and home responsibilities. Electronic devices and social media disrupt sleep. And finally, children and teens are worrying about family household stressors, things happening with friends and at school, their community safety, and the state of the world. While we work with our schools, communities, and local governments to support equity and safety, we have the power to do some simple things ourselves. For example, we can commit to a bedtime of 10 p.m. or earlier for ourselves and for our teens, which research shows decreases the risk of depression by 24% and the risk of anxiety by 20%. We can also spend as much time as possible outdoors and moving our bodies. I'm hoping the panel can talk about how school districts and local governments can change policies and practices so they truly support sleep and so everyone can take advantage of this human superpower. Thank you.
Wow, so many truths to that. I'm a big proponent of sleep. I need my 8 hours of sleep or else I'm cranky, right? So Audrey brought out a lot of good points. Lucia, what do you think, about this and when it comes to sleep and kids and mental health?
Yeah, sleep is so important. I think we all need our sleep. And I think going back to the technology issue, I think we are all guilty of being on our phones before we go to bed. So I think regulating that with your children and with yourself is really important. I think that's something everyone struggles with. And I think just sleep is so important and affects your child's performance, your child's emotions, and can be such a great routine builder for kids. And I think routine is just so important in a child's mental health.
Yeah. And Dr. Gill, I know, we've mentioned routines and all of this, but we also know that young teens, young adults, they don't want to go to sleep early. Any tips for parents on this topic?
So I think it's really important to kind of scaffold your teen toward independence and autonomy and just let them know that good sleep hygiene is not about punishing you for being young. It's about setting yourself up for success as you grow and navigate. I don't think they really would care about brain studies as much as an adult will, but really do talk to them about this is important to continue with brain development. And then also, again, we talk about family values. What are some incentives that you can provide in your family to make sure that your youth are navigating, even when they don't like the rules, but they're navigating the rules as being part of the family culture?
Oh, great. Thank you. And any last tips for our parents who are listening, who are trying to prepare their kids for back to school on Monday? Dr. Gill, I already went to you earlier. Lucia, do you have any, homework for the parents and what they can do, one step to make sure that their kids are healthy and happy this school year?
Yeah, I think I'm going to spin off what Principal Martin said and do those check-ins, but put my therapist spin on it and check in with your kids' feelings. Like, how are you feeling? What are those feelings? Validating them, right? Like, are you nervous? Are you excited for school starting? And then checking in with your kid. I think, like she said, right, sometimes we just ask kids, how was school? They say it was fine and we move on. And I think it only takes 5 extra minutes to check in with what those emotions are. And we have a better idea of how our child is doing. And it's so important for kids to be able to identify and express their emotions in so many situations.
So great. Thank you so much for joining us. Our discussion is already coming to a close. There's a lot to say on this topic, but I want to thank Lucia. I want to thank Dr. Gill for being part of this event. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
And I want to include a big thanks to the panelists who joined us earlier, Myra Rodriguez, Brian Coleman, Catherine Whitfield Martin. Thank you all for participating. This conversation wouldn't have been possible without all the Chicago parents who responded to our back to school survey this summer. We appreciate everyone who took the time to share their thoughts with us. This event couldn't have been developed without it. So if you would like more information about mental health resources in Chicago, don't forget to check out our resource guide, and that'll be available on wbez.org/mental health. As a reminder, we will send out an email to that guide for our Spanish speakers when that is finished and translated. And of course, we would love to hear from you and your thoughts about this event. You can share your feedback by filling out our post-event survey, which will be linked in the comment section on the YouTube and Zoom channels. So make sure you fill that out. Let us know what you thought. A big thank you to our community partners for helping with outreach and the creation and shaping of this event. Thank you to Illinois Latino News, Association House of Chicago, Chicagoland Mom Squad on Facebook, and the Chicago Reporter. Finally, don't think we forgot about the winners for the Jewel Osco gift cards. We've randomly selected 10 people who registered for this event, and we have some winners. So our winner for the $25 gift card goes to Roberto Menjivar, Nancy Rocha, Cristina Nieto, and Nancy Alvarez. Congratulations. The winner for the $50 gift card, we have Laura Garusik, Jamae Nellam, Morgan Halstead, Danny O'Farrell. Congratulations. And finally, 2 people who get $100 Jewel Osco gift cards, Mary Creamer and Patricia Kane. Congratulations and happy shopping. I'm sure there's a lot of last minute things you need to get. We will email you and you'll get those sent out to your email. Look for that. Thank you to everyone who's been watching. I want to thank our producer and Asha and Alex Keefe for making this possible today, our events team here at WBEZ. Thank you for everybody watching tonight, and we will see you next time. Have a good night.